Hi, everybody. I'm Tracy Hearn. I'm Luke's editor at Drawn and Quarterly. And it's a pleasure to be here today to launch his newest achievement, The Con Artists. Before we get started, I just want to acknowledge that this event is taking place virtually on many different territories. I'm located on the unceded territory of the Ganigahage, a land which has been a gathering place for many Indigenous nations. And we would like to thank all of our participating independent bookstores for supporting our D&Q live series this spring, including Skylight Books in LA, Floating World Comics in Portland, Librairie Drawn and Quarterly here in Montreal, and Beguiling Book and Arts in Toronto. If you order The Con Artist from any of these stores, you will receive a signed book plate. I don't have one to show you, but they're really nice. So I do encourage you to seek out these fine stores and get a copy. So on to today's event. We are incredibly honored to have Luke here today. Luke was born and raised in Dublin, Ireland, where he also received a BA in journalism. He has an MFA from the Center for Cartoon Studies in Vermont. And he has published 3 graphic novels prior to this one: Americana and The Act of Getting Over It, How to Survive the North, and Permanent Press. Luke's work has been exhibited in the Museum of Comics and Cartoon Art in Manhattan, and his clients include The New Yorker, BBC, Vice, and Narratively. In conversation today with Luke is comedian and comics fan Connor Ratliff. Connor is an actor and comedian and creator of the critically acclaimed podcast Dead Eyes. For the past decade, he has performed at the Upright Citizen Brigade Theater in New York City, where he created the George Lucas talk show, the live stream version of which has been described as the internet's coolest talk show and the worst podcast ever made. He currently performs at the weekly New York City Improv show, Rat Scraps, alongside some of the finest improvisers in the world. And from 2002 until 2015, he was in charge of the graphic novel section at the Barnes and Noble Union Square location, where he made sure to keep Drawn and Quarterly titles consistently in stock and on display, which made this a very important store for Drawn and Quarterly, all because of Connor. So thank you, Connor, for your work supporting comics. Connor seemed like the perfect person to put in conversation with Luke today, given Luke is also a comedian and member of the comedy community, and of course, comedy's role in The Con Artists, which is both a very funny book, and the main character, Frank, is a struggling, or maybe more kindly up-and-coming stand-up comedian. The Con Artist is not only hilarious, but also expertly cartooned. Luke is a master observer of human behavior, and his characters are instantly relatable in their flaws and neuroses and motivations and insecurities. When we all first read the book here, we were absolutely delighted at the subtlety and sensitivity of the book and of Luke's storytelling. So we're very honored to have published the book and really excited to have both Luke and Connor here today. So let's move on to that. Everyone at home, I don't know, clap, get excited. Connor and Luke are coming at you. I'm gonna go.
Hello. Thanks, Tracy. Very, very kind introduction. Really, really nice. And I hope everyone is clapping at home, just like maniacally and strangely. And thanks, Connor, for being here. Hello. I'm excited to get into a bit of a chat, but we're gonna start off with a short reading from the book. So I'm just gonna share my screen now. And we're gonna do that. Connor has very kindly agreed to help me act it out. Okay.
So, Frank, how was your week?
Um, I'm feeling a little anxious, honestly. Sorry if I seem weird.
No need to apologize. How was your friend?
Legally, it's hard to say.
What does that mean?
Are we protected by doctor-patient confidentiality?
I'm not a doctor, but essentially, yes.
You're not a doctor?
I'm a counselor. It's different.
Sorry, I didn't mean to sound surprised or judgmental, or
It's okay.
did I mention I'm feeling quite anxious?
You apologize for being anxious a lot, but to me, you mostly seem quite relaxed and confident.
Old habit, I guess. When I was a teenager, it was really bad. I couldn't talk to strangers. I couldn't order at restaurants. I was so afraid my friends would judge me, I'd cancel plans every weekend to sit at home playing World of Warcraft. Though to be honest, seeking to avoid judgment by playing an online video game was a real bonehead move. Those orcs were vicious.
You know, you don't have to be funny around me, Frank.
You think I'm funny?
Frank.
Right. Sorry. Oh, thanks so much. There we go.
It's
And
rare
you as well.
for scenes in comics don't get applause, and they should.
Yeah, I think so. If people reading the books could applaud more, it would really help my self-esteem just on the train, wherever they are.
It would be nice to see someone holding a copy of your book on the train and then just politely clapping to themselves.
That would do a lot for me, I think, actually.
It's so nice to meet you virtually in person, Luke. And congratulations on the book. Oh, look, I hold it up and it disappears with my
Uh-oh.
virtual screen, but I do have a real copy of it here.
I'll hold it up.
Yeah, I love the book. I think it's tremendous.
Thank you.
And
That's really kind. Thank you.
I'm looking forward to talking. I think we can get into the weeds here a little bit in terms of comedy and comics and your book.
I would love to. I would love to.
I was watching for people who there was you did a live at home like Q&A that was on YouTube that I watched the other day about the book, and I don't want to and because it's there and because it's there for people to seek out, I don't want to repeat. I watched it and I thought, oh, let's not repeat any of that, because you have some great answers about your process, about specifically how you approach the comics. And I thought, well, this would be a chance to get into some of the other things. So if people want to know your like technical comics process and things like that, you go into detail on that. But I wanted to follow up on some of the things that you said in that.
Oh my gosh, please.
Starting with for people who haven't read the book, I was very interested that it's a fictionalized it's a fiction story, but inspired by inspiration drawn from your actual life and some real events that have been reshaped and altered to suit your purposes and in the story you wanted to tell. But I was fascinated to learn from that you had begun the process with a completely, what sounds like a completely different book in mind, which was that you were documenting teaching and performing improv comedy.
Yeah.
And the way that worked, and which is, it's interesting. You're someone who does both improv and stand-up, which are two very, very different comedy disciplines. And in some ways, the fact that you end up with a book about stand-up is almost a complete 180 from starting out with a book about improv.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Well, improv is so hard to write about. You're an improviser, and
yeah,
it is so hard to capture what is good about improv in writing or in media in general. I'm sure, do you agree, recorded improv, it really doesn't have the same feeling of being in the room?
Usually, yeah, it's hard. It's tricky to capture, and most people who try to capture it, it loses some spark.
Yeah. Well, I think like for me, the big joy about seeing improv is that as the audience, like you're basically directing the show because obviously the improvisers are listening to your reactions, your laughs, or your groans, or whatever you're giving, and they're directing the show. They're directing the patterns in the show to follow your taste. So
Mhm.
it is sort of like a good improv show is electric in that way because it really is customized for, I guess, the majority of the audience's tastes. And so that is what's so special about improv. And I think when you write it down afterwards, it makes you often look like an idiot. At least that's how
Right.
I feel.
Well, I was curious whether, to me, when I heard you say that, I thought, oh, that means that that's a future book that you will eventually get back to. You didn't burn that material in this book because you're dealing with a completely different comedy discipline. Do you think you will attempt it again, or do you think that this book is the result of you realizing you're not going to write a book about your methodology in teaching it? Because also, I think writing about teaching improv is different than writing about improv shows or performing as an improviser.
Definitely. I mean, I think, I mean, I have a lot of thoughts about improv, like all improvisers. It's like, I think that when you get heavy into improv, it's like being into a sport or whatever, and you're the annoying person at a bar afterwards being like, oh, great move, you know, like
Right.
really, you know, it was a really great decision there. And so, you know, talking about improv is like the second arm of doing it. And I don't know, I haven't gotten tired of doing it in person yet, so it may find its way into a book at some point.
There's also, I think it made sense to me that it ultimately became about stand-up because improv is a collaborative and social medium. And not that there aren't lonely people doing improv, heaven knows, but stand-up is a much more, you know, just the sight of even a successful and confident stand-up is alone. And it feels like just the image of someone alone on stage behind a microphone facing an audience sort of feels more correct with the mood of the story you're telling in the way that the main character feels through a lot of it. Because a lot of the book is the main character feeling isolated with his thoughts, isolated with his fears. And then for the thing that he's doing for fun to be isolating himself in front of a crowd it works dramatically in a way that if he was on an improv team doing zip zap zop warm-ups, it would not funnel the same sort of mood.
I think that's definitely true. And I think that you know, as you said at the top, like the book is, a lot of it is based on real events. And I do feel really lucky that at that time when those things were really happening to me, that I was doing improv all the time and got to just be around a bunch of people who were being really silly and supportive. But yeah, I think stand-up is like a very, like the imagery of it is like very rich. And I also think that like the practicalities of writing about stand-up for a comic, because comics are all about like brevity, you know, like that's a big concern. And so stand-up only requires you to write about one character, but in improv it's like, okay, well, you've got at least three, you know.
Right.
Yeah.
And another way that it sort of ties in, and maybe this isn't a direct link, but it's something that was in my mind as I was thinking about this, is that in the same way that improv is different than sketch or stand-up in one really key distinction, which is that an audience that goes to an improv show, even if they're going to see a team that they know is really great, there's always an element of fear that like you're going to feel embarrassed and watch some people embarrass themselves.
Yeah.
They're going to be like, please just don't let it be bad.
Yeah.
And if it's even passable, the audience is delighted. They're so relieved that like you didn't humiliate yourself and by association me for coming to see this. Audiences don't feel that when they watch bad stand-up or bad sketch, because a stand-up comedian or a sketch team or a play in a theater, the assumption is you people worked on this. You thought about it and you considered that what you were bringing was worthy of presenting to me. So if you're bad, it's not my fault, it's your fault. And the audience is more likely to be angry at a bad stand-up, whereas they'll be sort of embarrassed by a bad improv team is like watching someone like soil their pants. It's just like, oh no, it's horrible.
Yeah.
But a bad stand-up, it's the audience almost has a feeling of, how dare you? Like, you thought this would be good enough to bring to me and take my money.
Yeah, well, I mean, in improv, you have the benefit of the doubt as well of like, oh, well, they're making it up on the spot, like, oh, but
Yeah.
like, when you do stand up, you are literally sitting down and being like, this is my taste in comedy. This is what
Yeah.
I think is funny. And if you're wrong, people hate it. And
you have no one, the audience's take on that is, you have no one to blame but yourself. You were wrong, not me, for coming here.
Yeah. And I think the fourth wall is also a big part of it. Is like, in stand-up, there's no fourth wall, right? Like, you're speaking to even though it's prepared material, you're speaking as though you're speaking to the people in the room. Whereas in improv, at least you have the shield of like, well, I'm not turning to look into your eyes and say these things to you that I think are funny.
But even a sketch group, it's sort of like, you rehearsed this, you memorized these lines. Like, you collectively as a group thought this was worthy.
Bad sketch might be the worst of all three, but maybe that's my bias showing.
Similarly, and this is why it was in my mind, I think a lot about, and a lot of your work, there's fiction and nonfiction, but even the purest of nonfiction is coming from a human being, a point of view. There's always some element of, you're selecting what information is presented in what order, and there's that slippery slope of based on a true story versus completely fictionalized.
Yeah.
And in the same way that an audience sort of bestows a different kind of approach when they're watching improv versus something prepared, there's that element of, when we watch something that is totally fictional versus something that this is a memoir, I'm saying this happened, and then inspired by true events, which is somewhere in between the two. But even memoir it's still selective. It's still, you're making choices, you're drawing it a certain way, you're giving your angle on it. Even if the most journalistic of comics has so much subjectivity, even in its presentation of objective fact. And one of the things that I'm interested in about this book is, when you're making those choices, what to keep, what to invent, what to alter, I'm interested in what are and I'm not asking you to peel back the curtain. It's more just like about your thought process for a real thing happens, or you do a real thing. And then what are some of the ways that you lean towards in terms of, and I'll have follow-ups on this, in terms of how you present yourself as a character, but I'm just curious what your initial thoughts on that, in terms of like, what do you lean towards when you're looking at like, this is a real thing that happened to me, I'm using it as fodder for fiction?
Yeah. I mean, I have a lot of thoughts about it, so please stop me if I'm going on. And obviously, like, one of the big questions in the book is like, the book asks you to consider what is or is not true in it, kind of explicitly. Even like the main character just repeats again and again, like, what is true, what is true. And I'm a real hardliner. Like, so I studied journalism for undergrad, and I was I was a really bad journalist, like, not ethically, but I just didn't have the confidence for it, I think. This is such a tangent, but my only job in journalism was, I was like a gossip columnist in Ireland, and there's not that much gossip. It was the worst job ever. But I am very hardline about, like, when I call something nonfiction, for me, it needs to be as close to my recollection of reality as I can present. If it's embellished at all, or if it's altered at all, I prefer to classify it as fiction, which is why this book is largely classified as fiction, because although a lot of it is inspired by true things, certain characters are like mashed up together, and certain events are reordered, and certain events are like fictionalized slightly. Like, so for me, like, as soon as that one of those choices is made, it needs to be like tipped over into fiction, like the classification. But it is funny because, so my first book was like historical nonfiction with fictional elements in it. And oh no, you have it. Oh, cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
But in it, I really wanted that book to be classified as fiction as well because it has fictional elements. But after I did that, I had this big crisis of like, I'm writing about these people's lives, I'm changing it. It's like, as you said, it's so subjective that really from now on, I just need to write about myself. And then at least if I'm altering stuff, it's just about me. And I won't be misrepresenting anybody's like life experience, but my own.
Yeah.
So yeah, I get kind of obsessive about it.
I think I really like your approach in that book because especially you have the end note where you basically explain that of the three main arcs, there's one that's totally made up and there's two that are based on historical things, but also those historical records are just other people telling what happened. There's only so much that at a certain point somebody tells you something that happened and there's an element of trust, but we all know no two people tell the same story the same way or have the same memory or even the same experience, the same truth often of a situation.
Definitely.
But I feel like you really play fair in the way that you present that. It like I didn't know you had a journalistic background, but I think I could have gleaned it from the tone of the footnote that you were very like, here's what's what about each part of this,
Yeah, I mean, that was me at the like height of my journalistic anxiety too, I think, where I was really like, this matters, and I still think it does. But at that point I was really freaking about it.
And to some extent, the very act of transforming something that really happened into illustrations, pen and ink illustrations, the reader has some aspect of whether they're conscious of it or not, that like this is a version of reality. Just the medium itself, nobody thinks, well, it looked exactly like this because
we're not watching CCTV.
Yeah. But it's also, that's where the art comes into it. The blending of art and journalism is an interesting thing in terms of the ethics of art are very different than the ethics of reporting, but that's where I think the medium has some of its strength, is that if you show people a documentary, even though we know that film can be manipulated, there's some assumption that what we're seeing is real or as close to real as possible. When we see comics dealing with nonfiction, it's almost, the disclaimer is almost embedded in the medium, which is like, well, we drew this, so obviously there's one layer of liberties already being taken.
Well, you can see something I really like about nonfiction comics is you can see the artist's hand, like almost literally, right? Because you're seeing their marks that they've made with their hand. Like it's so obviously from one person's point of view.
Yeah, and it emphasizes what's personal about a comic is that this is a created thing. This is the way that they're communicating this information to you. And sometimes in nonfiction comics, when there's like a big block of text, it sort of communicates like, this is all, trust all of this because these are just words. We would have drawn this if we could have conveyed this in pictures and in panels. In terms of how you present yourself in, well, let me ask this. How long have you had the beard?
It's 3 months, maybe.
3 months?
A little bit less. Yeah.
Prior to that, how often have you had a beard?
I only grew my beard for the first time during the pandemic. So
okay.
Well, no, that's not true. I did a book called Americana about, I hiked like across the US, and that I grew a beard when I was doing that. Oh my God, you have that too. Oh, that's so nice. Thanks.
Yeah.
Can I tell a really quick anecdote about that book that'll like maybe put you on the spot, but I don't mean to. So that for the people who don't know, that book is about that's a nonfiction memoir book about my walking across the United States. And when I got to Washington, which is the last section, I was really bored of myself. And so I was listening to loads of podcasts. And one of the podcasts I listened to was yours, 12 Hour Day, the 12-hour long podcast.
Wow.
Yeah, so there you go.
12-hour Day with JD and Connor, a podcast with me and my friend JD Amato, where every episode is at least 12 hours long. And I mostly, the only editing is ever because of a technical malfunction. where we lose batteries or we lose sections of it. But we usually run long. Most of the episodes are about 13, 14 hours long.
Yeah. And it was really nice to find time to listen to them finally. Being alone in the woods, it was like, here we go.
That is maybe the ideal circumstance. That hike is probably the ideal. That's our target audience, maybe, is people who are going through long periods of walking in the wild.
It was nice to take a break and hear people walking around a city.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
What an interesting contrast. Now what I was going to say is because in the con artist, like the way that you present yourself at the beginning totally clean shaven, and then you put on the mustache as if it's a disguise, as if it's a costume piece to sort of distinguish, which I think is a really lovely device. That opening little prologue preamble is a nice way of sort of establishing, like, I'm telling you this story and there are elements of theater to this, elements of invention. But it did occur to me when I was watching your live thing that people with drawing, I always find it's easy to draw myself because as long as I have the beard, it kind of doesn't matter. And when I have my glasses on, then it's sort of like those basic shapes convey in a very basic it's like drawing Mickey Mouse or Charlie Brown or something, where it's like you just get these simple shapes. You don't actually have to get the nose right or the mouth right. You just get the beard is a real easy way of outlining an autobiographical self-portrait.
It's really like the best thing about cartooning, or for me, is like the simpler the better. And all you need is one distinguishing feature. Like all of my characters look identical. Basically, they all have the same face, except that the one that's me has like dark hair, basically, in all my books. I'm like, well, there you go.
Yeah. Now, what I find is when I'm, in anything I'm doing, whether it's, I've done comedy things where I present like a comedy version of myself. 12-hour Day is probably in some ways the most real version of me, in that it's just me talking to JD. I'm not putting on a persona. But even that, there's a lot of, we put up a lot of sort of like firewalls when we're doing that podcast, because there's certain things we don't talk about, because with that length of a podcast, it's very easy to fall into being too revealing about yourself.
Right.
With a comics avatar, when you're writing books where you are a character, even if it's just presenting at the beginning of this, like I'm the inspiration for this character, but it's me, but not me. What are some of the differences that you clock, that you, if you feel comfortable saying this kind of thing? What are some of do you have things like that you're like, well, this aspect of my personality is something that I'm not going to include in my autobiographical comics persona? Like, do you have those distinctions that you're aware of, or is it just you feel it out?
I guess I feel it out project to project, but there definitely are things that like I've never really written about. Like I don't write about like romantic relationships really. And I also, because that feels like really writing about somebody else in like a very intimate way. And I guess in this book, the other main character, Giorgio, who is based on a couple of real people put together, like that is sort of an intimate relationship, but this is by far the most intimate sort of like portrait of another person that I've ever included in my work who is in my life.
Yeah.
Although, even that being said, like I always really try to keep it from my perspective, or in this case from Frank, the lead character's perspective, where everything that happens is really a reflection. I try to make it more of a reflection on him or on me than on the other person, because I think, especially in this book, but even in other books, it's like you never really know the other characters. You don't get to know them. They're always sort of removed from either myself or the stand-in, because you hear the narration from my perspective or from the stand-in's perspective, and it's like really the relationship is between the reader and me. Like that's the kind of intimate relationship. And what I'm trying to do when I make a book and this might sound corny, but what I'm trying to do is like I'm a pretty repressed guy. Like I grew up in like Catholic Ireland in the 90s. So like it wasn't wasn't the best for like talking about your feelings, I suppose.
Yeah.
And so what I do a book, really what I'm trying to communicate is like I have a hard time saying how I feel, expressing how I feel about what in this case is like were very difficult, like kind of traumatic events. But if I write 200 pages telling you what happened, then maybe you'll understand how I feel. And so I always try to have that be the relationship. But my relationships to other people, I think, are like kind of surface level in a lot of my writing.
Mm-hmm. Whenever I find the more, and this is sort of a cliche thing that you hear a lot, but it's one of those cliches. I think it's true that whenever I'm creating characters, that even if they're not the character that I'd be playing, if I'm writing something, at a certain point, I will realize that even though I think I'm writing other characters, I'm really writing myself into that other person.
Yeah.
And I wondered about that specifically. And this may have been something that came from a real encounter, but it was one that sort of, when I was rereading it, jumped out at me, is when after the stand-up show, when Giorgio basically gives the full these stories you tell with all your little twists and tweaks, you make yourself such a hero, so damn reasonable, and he really like reads you the riot act on like the way you present yourself. And of course, this is existing within a comic in which you are once again like in control of the story.
Yeah.
So there's the multiple layers in terms of, you can almost imagine. I then started thinking like the real life version of the person in your life who would have this opinion of your work would then say, look at what you're doing. You're putting this criticism in to show how you are just as hard on yourself. Like there's an interesting cycle that happens with that type of thing. First of all, just when you're writing something like that, how much of it is drawing from your own self-criticism versus maybe a real incident where someone read you the riot act?
That's pretty much all self-criticism. Like, it's funny because when I started, it's interesting you said that, because I totally agree. Like when I started writing that scene, I was like, well, I need to spell out to the reader that like writing this book makes me like a piece of shit, basically. But that is so letting myself off the hook that then putting it in was actually kind of more exposing, because it's like, oh, well, you can't just say that and then you're absolved. Like the actual like noble or like, whatever choice, the moral choice is to just stop making this book, like give back your advance and like move on with your life and leave these people alone. Which is maybe the more responsible choice.
That's sort of the cousin of I always say that if most improv scenes, if they happen in real life, the second line would be, I don't like this, I'm going to leave.
Yeah. Bye, actually. Sorry.
Yeah. That's a second line that works in almost any improv scene is, I'm sorry, I don't like this, I'm going to leave now.
A strong move to just leave every scene on the second line.
If you trust your scene partner, they can handle it. I also say that there's nothing better if you really know what you're doing in improv. There's nothing you kind of secretly crave more than the opportunity for your scene partner to just walk out and you're like, well, because there is a thing where people are afraid. That's like a nightmare scenario, that what if my scene partner leaves and I'm alone on stage? And in an improv, what they don't realize sometimes is like literally you can just say what's happening and how you're feeling and the audience will think it's comedy. You can just be like, well, now I'm alone, I have nothing to say and I'm terrified, and the audience will just laugh.
That's my favorite thing about improv, because I like, as you said, I teach and I like coach improv a lot, and the thing I'm always trying to get people to do is just act like themselves, basically, and try not to have an audience laugh. As long as you just basically play like, or just be grounded in a scene, just be a postman. Like the audience, it's so funny. The only way to be bad at improv is to keep trying to be funny too hard.
Almost every improv scene I do is me trying to do dramatic theater, and then you inevitably fail within 30 seconds. It's really hard. A person I do improv with a lot, we've done a show every now and then where we announce at the beginning that it's not a comedy show and we're not trying to be funny, and we see how, and you have to work so hard to make an audience that wants to laugh not laugh. Like you have to really punish the audience dramatically to get them to take you seriously, because the second you say something that's even slightly silly or funny or sounds weird, they will laugh as if it's the funniest joke anyone ever wrote.
Yeah. How long is your record for that show? How far have you gotten in before they left?
Time wise, we've gotten a few minutes in, but the thing is, if we get a laugh, we get so angry. I get so angry that then we double down on it. And sometimes you can actually get more intense after that. We have done the show a couple of times where someone in the audience has something so dramatic has happened that somebody else goes, Jesus Christ. You can just hear someone in the audience just going, oh my God. They just can't believe it.
That's like the dream. That's all I want from my improv shows, to shock.
Yeah. To make people feel something that deeply. Now, the another thing that's also interesting to me in the way that you came across this is that the starting off from a position of, I'm going to document what it's like teaching and performing in improv. I'm going to document that a lot of great documentaries start off, they're investigating some, city council, and they stumble upon a murder, like something more interesting happens,
Mm-hmm.
One of my favorite movies is the Thin Blue Line, which is an Errol Morris documentary where he basically got an innocent man off of death row, but he didn't start out investigating that. He was investigating something else in Texas, and he stumbled upon it. I really love the fact that you started off with what to some people might sound like a book they would have no interest in reading, which is like, a comic about improv.
Hideous.
Very niche. And then as you were documenting what was going on, more interesting and more dramatic events occurred while essentially the comic equivalent of cameras were running. Basically, you were in sort of documentarian mode, and then more interesting things happened. And then to take the further leap of, this would be better if I could calibrate the elements to make fiction and have full control. Because that's another thing in terms of how, when we read something that we think is nonfiction, there's certain things similarly to improv that a reader will tolerate certain things. I was watching that show, American Crime Story Impeachment, which is all about the Lewinsky scandal. And there's an episode that's all about the FBI sort of like babysitting Monica Lewinsky in a hotel, and there's a mall attached to the hotel. And the episode is very mundane. It's a lot of, they go to a chain restaurant, they go to like a Crate and Barrel, and they're like browsing for stuff. And I immediately went and looked up like how much of this episode is what really happened that day. And it was all exactly what happened. I thought, great. But if they'd been making it up, I would have been like, why'd you go to Crate and Barrel? Like, we didn't need to, like, there's a different standard for dramatic fiction than for a true story.
Yeah. And I think as well, like, people will tolerate that, the, like, I guess for lack of a better term, like the boring stuff, but people will also tolerate more dramatic stuff if they know that it's real. Like, so for example, from this book, the opening of the book and the sort of setup for the book is that the character who's based on me, his friend gets hit by a bus, and he goes to take care of him, and then discovers that he's living sort of this like lie. And but in the book, the day after his friend gets hit by the bus, or the day after he goes in to take care of him, is his first day of therapy ever. And that is like an annoying coincidence if it's not true. And it is true. Like, this basically like a very, very similar event happened in my life, and I was stressed out of my mind. And then I went to my first ever session of therapy and walked in. I was basically just like a nervous wreck. I was like, this is a problem, but like not usually like this,
And I think it does. It's very wise of you to, rather than just presenting it as fiction, give yourself that license of, it's fiction, but I'm using real ingredients. Like, because I don't know, as a reader, I then am on board for anything. Like, there's no, like, I never questioned. Whereas if this was a complete work of fiction and you just presented as like, this is just a story I made up, then I might have seen those things, and my critical like reader mode might have been like, well, it's a bit, I see what the device is you're using. as opposed to when coincidental things happen in real life, they're just true. When they happen in when we insert them because we need them as a device in fiction, then they suddenly are these cardinal sins that, how dare you rely on cliche, even though cliche is usually based on things being very popular and everyone liking them and everyone doing them and using them and saying them. I have, because I think we're at the point where we should do I have some questions here. I have 6 questions. I haven't looked at them. I'm going to read them to you cold. All right.
I'm excited.
Isaiah Bornman asks, what would you imagine the ideal amount of the book to read in a setting? A story a day, or go for a big chunk in a weekend?
Of this book?
I assume.
You could probably read it all in like 2 hours. So.
I always think that's the most heartbreaking thing about comics and graphic novels.
Yeah.
Is I wanted to be a cartoonist growing up, and I didn't have the stick-to-itiveness. There was a point where I realized I would never be good enough to be happy doing it. And
I realized that, but then just kept doing it.
My hat's off to you. Thank you for your service. But I do find it heartbreaking when I read a graphic novel too fast, because sometimes it's like someone spent a decade on something, and then I'll whiz through it and I will feel ashamed.
I went to a school called the Center for Cartoon Studies, and James Sturm, who's a great cartoonist, is one of the teachers. He founded the school, and he said to our class once, because everybody at the school was so mad because we would do these assignments for weeks and then they would be read in like 30 seconds, right? But he said you have to multiply it out by all of the people who read it.
Yes.
Because it took you a year, but people are going to be reading it for way longer than that if you add up all the different people.
Yeah. It's true. It's also true of film and television or music or any of these things that, like, it takes 3 minutes to listen to a pop song. It takes 2 hours to watch a movie, but there's something about comics where I notice it more, where I will read through a graphic novel and I'll be like, just because I think it's easier for me to get into my head the idea of how long it would have taken me to do it.
Interesting. I think it's like because we're familiar with reading prose books and we know how long they sort of take an infamously long time, where people are like, I haven't gotten through my to read pile or whatever. It's like if you had a to read pile of comics, it's like, you're done. Yeah.
This is for both of us. It's 3 questions from Gohan Squirtle. Question for you: what's your favorite moment from 12-Hour Day?
Oh, well,
so many to choose from.
I mean, this is okay. I'm trying to remember. No, okay, I have one. Does that make me seem like a spooky stalker to remember?
Nope, not at all. It's my fault for making the podcast.
Okay, great. It's right at the start of the first one, and you and JD are leaving from having seen Wolf of Wall Street.
Yeah.
And I also saw Wolf of Wall Street in New York City when I lived in America. And so it really weirdly brings me back to that.
Dumb that before we recorded our first 12-hour episode, we went to see a movie that's almost 3 hours long, and it's not part of the episode.
Hilarious.
The second question is for me. What is my favorite Luke Healy comic moment? I'll say, just for promotional and also sincere reasons, I'll pick a moment from the Con Artists. I really liked, without too much of a spoiler, I don't want to spoil it. I really liked the tension of when the package is delivered and you're home, or you're the character that is the stand-in for you is home. I really like that. To me, is a very, very exciting sequence that goes over multiple pages, and it genuinely made me stressed.
Oh, good. Well, not good, but
yeah. I'll also mention, just because I got it here in press. I really liked the fact that I was so shocked at how complete the comics within this book felt. I like the way that the whole of the Unofficial Cuckoo's Nest study companion was really exciting to me, both formally and just dramatically.
Thank you.
I really liked it.
Thanks.
I recommend it.
I think not to undersell the con artist, which of course everyone should buy, but I think like
Absolutely.
page for page, that section of permanent press is probably the best comics I'll ever make. But it's not long enough to be a full book, and it took forever. So
Uh, it's great. And it's also, and this is probably a semi-insulting thing to say in some ways. I'm always, there's always that thing of like, with anytime a comic is good, people are like, are you going to make a movie or a TV thing of it? When it really is like such a different medium. But one of the things that's great about that section is, part of me thought this would make a great TV series or film, but it would automatically be so different because you use so many different formal techniques that there's no actual way to adapt it. You just have to use it as the inspiration for a totally new thing that had the same story beats. But and then the third question is for both of us. What is your favorite comic book? Very hard question.
I have an answer if you want me to go first.
Yes.
My favorite comic book, I think I said it on the Q&A or the live stream thing the other day, but it's Today is the Last Day of the Rest of Your Life by Uli Lust. I think it is like a masterpiece, like unimpeachably incredible piece of literature that it's my favorite thing ever committed to print. I think it's amazing.
I need to read that because I have not read that. And when you brought that out, I made a note that I need to track it down and find it. I'm trying to think which one. I think it's hard for me to nail down one thing, but I will say, I think it's like the 18th volume of Acme Novelty Library, which is part of Building Stories. It's like the hardbound book that in the big box of books, it's like a little, but a lot of it has to do with like the death of the main character's cat. And it's so sad. And it's a comic that I bought it when I was working at Barnes & Noble Union Square. I bought it. And after work, I was walking down to, I think, IFC Center, and it was freezing cold. And I read the whole book sitting on a park bench near the IFC Center. And when I was done, I hadn't realized that my hands were so cold I couldn't move them. I was just barely able to turn the pages. And I had so gotten lost in the world of the emotion of that book that I had put my body at risk with the cold weather. Anonymous attendee asks, in the book, there are scenes where the characters are telling their jokes before an audience. Do you use your own jokes to shape these sequences?
Yes. So some of them. So the material that the characters have done in for me says are basically just material that I was doing before COVID. And maybe still again, who knows. And then the jokes that the other stand-up who appears in the book, her name is Ro in the book. She's based on a friend of mine who's a comedian who I'll just shout out because there's nothing embarrassing about her in the book. Her name is Loife Haraldsdottir, and she's an Icelandic comedian. And the parts that are her stand-up is basically like me parodying her real stand-up. And so it was like kind of a fun thing to be able to try to write what she would do, but like kind of gently rib at it as well.
That's great. I always find that whenever comedians like are able to sort of nail the game of another comedian's like act or like imitate in a funny way, it's always one of the most endearing things to me, because in some ways it's an act of affection. In some ways it can be just brutal. Even if it's flattering, there's something about like, I can do my act and I can also do your act in a way that's like very fun and funny.
It's kind of a compliment. It's like a devastating compliment because it means you have a clear enough voice that someone can imitate it, but it's not nice to feel seen,
Yeah. Lucia Gargiulo, apologize if I mangled that name. Is it Gargiulo? Yeah. How was your experience formally studying comics? Would you recommend it?
I had a really good time, and I would recommend it for some people. Basically, I think I don't know if I think it's not really specific to the program that I did, but I think that in order to get the most out of it, you have to be really self-motivated and self-directed. Like you've kind of got to have your own engine, and I think so I went to the Center for Cartoon Studies, which is a great program, and I really loved it. But I, not to like valorize the grind or whatever, but I put in a lot of extra hours and like did a lot of extra work. And because it was a big deal for me to get to live in America and go to the school, like I really, really tried to make the most of it. And I think that I got a lot out of it. But I think that if you're not there kind of by yourself, like doing a lot of hard work before you would go to a program, like you might want to take some time and like build up to it, basically.
Yeah. I would imagine it's also one of those things that different personality types, you probably know if you have the curiosity of to do formal training for it, it's probably a good sign that it's for you. Whereas if the idea of formally training seems like it seems like a bad, like something you're not interested, then it's probably not for you.
Yeah. And I think as well, don't apply to a program if you like haven't made comics before. Like make a bunch of them first to really see if
you like it. Yeah.
The idea of making them is really different from the reality of making them.
Yeah. I remember the moment when my comics and cartooning ambitions, I remember several moments when they died. And one of them was my Uncle Liam was an artist in Dublin. He was like a child prodigy, and he did a lot of commercial art, and he was designing like a logo for like bread. It was just like the little, you draw the little farm and the horse or whatever goes on a bag of bread. And I remember thinking, what if I had to draw something and I didn't want to, and my hand hurt? And that was enough. I was like, wow. I'm out. It's the same reason I don't play the guitar. Someone tried to teach me and I was like, this is hurting my fingers. And somebody said, oh, you'll get calluses on your fingers. I was like, what? Like, oh, your fingers. And I looked at their fingers and I was like, I'm out. I will bail on any art form the first sign of physical discomfort.
You basically just read the job description, which is you have to draw something you don't want on your hand hurts. Like that is to be a cartoonist.
Yeah.
Basically.
Anonymous attendee says, how long did it take you to develop your style? And do you feel like it's still evolving? I feel like I know at least part of the answer to this question.
Wait, what's the answer you think you know?
I assume just from the way that you talk and the way that you write that you feel like your style will always be evolving.
Yeah, I think that's really true. I think my book, like the book even I'm working on now, is so different from the con artists in a lot of ways. So yeah, still evolving, always evolving. I think it took a good 5 years before I had made anything that I liked.
I also think not all cartoonists, maybe, because I think some people lock into a style, but I always feel like there's sort of the Charles Schultz model where if you read 50 Years of Peanuts, you're basically, you think you're reading a comic strip about a bunch of little kids who have adult anxieties, but you're really reading this sort of like tone poem autobiography of one man, and all of these characters are him. And eventually they stop being kids and start being old people who look like kids, and they're all just versions of who he is. And I feel like there is that thing where the style is the story of the cartoonist in a way, and who they are at different points of their life.
Yeah, and what an exciting, fun thing to read.
Julia Pohl Miranda says, what's next? Are you working on anything new?
I am. Yeah, I'm working on a new book that, I can say, it hasn't been announced, but I can say it's called Selfish. And it is basically, it's another sort of like fiction. This one's really hard. It's like a fake memoir of the next 20 years of my life. And It's basically just about me being a big narcissist and caring about my career while climate change destroys the earth and like floods every major city. But I'm like, will I work again?
I love it.
Yeah. And that's 2024. That's coming out. So
Francis Cheng says, I used to love drawing comics, but had a long gap of a couple of years where I didn't draw any. Now I have art block. How do you get back into the groove of drawing comics?
Make short stuff and make really bad stuff. I'm a terrible perfectionist, and my big problem is often getting started. And just sit down and try to make the worst comic you can purposefully, but just finish it. But like try to make it horrible, and then by the end you'll want to make something good.
Boone Philagus says, how did your stand-up set go that you had after your Instagram live?
Oh, it went really well, actually. Yeah, I tried a new opener.
Was this the knock-knock joke?
It was not. It was, I went on stage, I improvised it, but maybe I'll keep it again. But I walked in and said, sorry if I'm seeming really nervous. This is my first time performing stand-up. while wearing a hat. It's like a whole other world. Anyway, and it killed. So yes, thanks for asking.
Anonymous attendee says, who is the real con artist in the book?
There's 3 con artists, Giorgio, Frank, and me.
Great. And then one last question. That is the 3-part question. Xander L says, what is your favorite part of making a comic, the writing or the drawing, and why?
The writing. Drawing takes 2 years. Writing takes 2 months.
Great.
And
Perfect
I think
answer.
we're gonna leave it at that. Thank you so much, Luke and Connor. That was so much fun, so lively, and we all loved hearing more about the book. And I would encourage everyone at home, if they don't already have a copy, to please purchase one from any local independent bookstore. But if you could, it would be great to support our supporting bookstores, which are Skylight Books in LA, Floating World Comics in Portland, Librairie Drawn and Quarterly here in Montreal, and the Beguiling Books and Art in Toronto. Thanks again, everyone. And someone just asked if the book is in bookstores, and it is. It's out. We're celebrating that reality. So everyone can buy it. And thanks again. And goodbye, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye. Thanks.